Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on SAT and ACT accommodations, that is extra time or other special considerations for the SAT and ACT. A topic we get asked about a lot at UES, something that comes up at every single school that we work with internationally, something that is very confusing and requires a lot of thought and careful preparation. So rather than answer the same questions over and over again, what I thought I would do is do a webinar to cover everything that comes up. This is in conjunction with our blog, which we reposted the other day with updates. I will give you the link to that in a moment. But the idea of this is so that you can watch this, listen to it carefully, make notes, read the blog, and hopefully be able to get through applying for accommodations as straightforwardly as possible. I am going to share my screen and hope that you can all see that. I'm going to talk about SAT and ACT accommodations today. But first of all, a little bit about UES. We were founded in 2013, almost 10 years ago. We work with about 800 students a year, mostly in the UK. We help with all aspects of American applications, also international applications, choosing colleges, writing college essays, college counselling. Of course, SAT and ACT prep is part of that, and we work with a lot of schools. Now, this webinar comes in two halves. The first half is about which test students should do, and this is particularly related to students and families. So the first half is about students and families and what they should do. So first of all, which test and what options are available, when to apply for accommodations, that is extra time, what documentation is required in order to do that successfully, how to apply, and the differences between the SAT and ACT application processes, and then the common mistakes and problems that come up as part of this, and also a little bit on how the digital SAT is going to affect our advice. In the second half of this webinar, I'm going to be talking to schools. In particular, I'm going to be talking about informing the families early, then about the various options of accommodations that are available. That includes the ACT in school or at a test centre, or the current SAT on paper, or the new digital SAT on computer or paper. I'm going to be talking about what schools should do right now, regardless of whether they have any students who they think might need it. And this includes things like the CEEB code, so identify the school, the role of the SENCO coordinator in the school, gaining access to the portals in order to submit requests. I'm going to talk about the documentation that's required. When you do have students who need accommodations, I'm going to talk about how to request those accommodations, again, the differences between the processes, and how to administer the ACT in school, if that's the route you go down, and the common problems and mistakes, again. But first of all, I just want to talk about what accommodations are. Just to clarify, I'm specifically talking about the SAT and ACT, the US standardized test for entrance to college. Those tests are also used outside of the US, particularly in Europe. Also, the UK will look at them, Far East will look at them as well. It's really important to make sure that you understand whether or not you're going to be testing, when you should start testing, etc. With all of this stuff, our advice is always to start early. Accommodations are any allowances for the student outside of the usual test format. So extra time is the most common, but it also includes other things. So what are those other things? What accommodations are available? So let's talk about the SAT and the ACT separately, and I'm even going to break down the SAT into two halves. Most of the people who will be watching this on a recording will be thinking about the new SAT, and that's because the current SAT will be administered for the last time in December. There's only one test left outside of the US. Now, without accommodations, that test in December will be done on paper. It takes about 3 hours. It's done at a test centre, which is usually a school, usually not the student's own school, unless it is a test centre. The extra time available for that test is 50% extra time, so that makes it a 4.5 hour test, all done on the same day at the same test centre. So just to be clear, if you're doing the SAT and you get accommodations extra time, you'll be doing it at that test centre, still on paper and on the same day. So you can't do it over multiple days. The other accommodations that are available, though, are Braille, large print, answer sheet with no bubbles. But whatever you do, it's always on paper. There is no essay. So there's no point in requesting word processing like a laptop because it is on paper. Now, the test centres for these accommodations, there are lots of them available. Lots of the big international schools host the SAT with accommodations. It's very unlikely to be your own school unless you go to one of those schools. But let's talk about the new SAT, which is coming in March next year, without accommodations. So for students who are doing the test as it is by default, it's done on your own laptop. It's only 2 hours long, and it's done at a test centre, those same test centres, a school, not your own school. But if you get extra time, you will have the same options, 50% extra time, which makes it a 3-hour test, all done on the same day at that same test centre. Other accommodations available, though, and here's where things get a bit different. You can choose to do it on paper or on computer, which you specify in advance. And you do it in the same test centre as other people. Now, the other options are still Braille, large print, answer sheet with no bubbles. Of course, that's going to be on paper. But again, you'll be doing it at that test centre. You won't be doing it in your own school unless you go to a school that is a test centre. Again, lots of test centres available for those accommodations. The same ones that are hosting at the moment, big international or American schools. So what accommodations are available for the ACT, which is not changing? So normally, just to explain, the ACT is on computer, it's 3 hours long, and you do it at a dedicated computer test center. Now, if you get extra time, you will either get 50% extra time, or you could get 100% extra time, or even 200% extra time. That's either done on the same day or over multiple days. But if you do it at a test center, it will all be done on the same day, and it will only be 50% extra. Or if you do it in your own school, it will be done either on the same day or over multiple days. So if you go to a test center, it must be on computer. It won't be on paper. It must be done in one sitting, and it must be done on the official test date. There is only one test centre available in the UK for accommodations at the moment, and that is Marlborough College. That may change. Alternatively, you could do it on paper in your own school, but the school must agree to that, and we'll come on to that. You can do it on any date up to 16 days after the official test date. You agree that in advance with your school. You can't do it on computer in your own school. Now, there is an ACT essay, but you should not do the essay. So the word processing is irrelevant for you. So you will do it on paper if it's in your own school. Again, there are other formats available, Braille, large print. You could have a reader who reads out the questions for you, recorded audio, etc. And it's normally done in your own school. So I hope that's clear. Just to summarize, SAT, you'll go to a test center. ACT, you could go to a test center, there's not many available, or you would do it on paper in your own school if your school agrees. So let's talk about students and parents. Just to be careful about this, schools should also watch this section because it'll give you an idea of what goes on from the student's perspective. Do refer to our blog here. There's a blog, SAT, ACT Accommodations. And in fact, what I'm going to do just to show you, I'm going to stop sharing that for the moment. I'm going to get up our blog and share my screen so you're aware of it. There it is. Hopefully you can see that there, and that shows you our blog. It's got everything that I'm going to talk about today in a lot of detail with some screenshots and stuff. Please send that on to your school. If you are a school, please send that on to your students. And there's the link. Okay, I'm going to go back to this presentation. Okay, so let's talk about what students and parents have to do. First of all, when do you apply for these accommodations? Now, I would say as early as possible, that is true, but you should not rush. Please, if you're thinking about getting accommodations, pause first and make the right decisions. And the reason for that is that if you go wrong and you apply for the wrong thing or register for the wrong test, it is very, very hard to get it changed later. So don't rush. I know that if you're in year 12, you might be thinking, oh gosh, I need to get this done. You do, but you must make the right decision first. So please be very careful about it. You should ideally start in year 11, which is grade 10 or junior year. That will give you plenty of time to make sure that you can get everything together. Otherwise, make sure it's 3 to 4 months before the first date that you want to take this test. So in the summer after year 11 is great because you've got plenty of time to get it ready for December. Now, if you are planning on taking the December test with accommodations, you could possibly do it, but it's a big, big rush to get this ready. Probably not going to be ready until February or March. So go to your school now and tell them that you would like accommodations. They are going to have to submit all the documentation, whether you do it in school or not. Show your school this guide so they understand the process. At the top of that blog I showed you, it does have a link to this webinar, so schools can watch this too. Then agree with them what format you're going to do. Are you going to do the ACT in your school, or are you going to take the SAT or ACT at a test centre? Decide which test to take. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Get an education psychologist report. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment as well. Very important. Do not book any test dates yet. Like I said, you've got to make sure that you have everything in place before you start booking things. You've got to know which tests you're doing, where and how, in which format. Okay, so how do you decide whether to do the SAT or ACT? We do have a diagnostic test that's right there. Most students in the UK and internationally take that diagnostic test to work out which test they're best at. And it does take into account accommodations. Now, if you get accommodations though, extra time, there is less time pressure than normal, of course. And therefore the differences between the tests become less. So you should consider where is the nearest test centre that can support extra time students. So if you're you want to do ACT, but there's not an ACT centre anywhere near you that has accommodations, remember it's pretty much only Marlborough College that does it, you might not want to do that test. Would your school let you do the test in school? And that would have to be the ACT on paper. So if they would let you, that could be a really good option. Would you prefer to do the test on paper or on a laptop? If you want to do it on a laptop, you're going to have to do it in a computer test centre for the ACT or take the digital SAT. Do you need to take the test over multiple days? Then you are probably going to have to do the ACT in school. That is probably the only way. So our advice, if your school will let you do the ACT in school, that might be the best option. It's very comfortable, you do it on paper, you're in your familiar environment, and you choose the date. If not, the SAT is probably a better option because there are more test centres that allow extra time. This is even true of the new digital SAT because you will get to choose whether it's on paper or on computer, and you won't have to worry about trying to find a place. Bear in mind, though, that the maths on the SAT is more in depth. So if you really, really hate maths and can't cope with it, it might be better to stick with the ACT route. So what do you need? What documentation do you need to try and get your accommodations? First of all, you're probably going to need proof that you were already receiving accommodations or extra time at GCSE level. So year 10, 11, grades 9, 10. If you don't already get extra time, then you've got to apply for that first in your school exams. If you don't get it in your school exams, not eligible for it in your school exams, you're not going to get it for the SAT or ACT. Now, I want to clear up a point of confusion here because I did say earlier that the minimum amount of extra time on the SAT or ACT is 50%. In the UK, generally people get 25% extra time. That doesn't mean that you're not eligible for extra time on the SAT or ACT. You've just got to make sure you apply properly. all the evidence that you originally needed for accommodations on school exams. You've got to get that all together and make sure you know where it is. The school should hopefully have it. Here's a really important thing. You will probably want to get a new Ed Psych report, an educational psychologist report, dated in the last year that specifically references standardized tests. It is possible to get accommodations granted without that. I would highly recommend that you pause, you take time, you get a new Ed Psych report that specifically mentions standardized tests, and you apply with that. It will make your life much easier if you do that. If you need a recommendation for a good educational psychologist who does these sorts of things, then we can give you a trustworthy recommendation. Your school's SENCO. So this is the person who deals with extra time and accommodations, needs to submit everything, or someone in the school who's qualified to do that. Ideally, along with a note about which format you require, because if you want to do it on paper in school, the ACT, then you need to state that. If you want to do the digital SAT, but do it on paper, they will need to say that. So they need to explain what particular things you need, otherwise it might not happen. You need to make sure that anything relating to writing or typing is unlikely to matter, because the test is multiple choice. There's no writing component. Do not do the ACT essay. No one cares. So please don't worry about that. So it means that you don't have to worry about typing or word processing or writing. You just do the format that you prefer for multiple choice. Okay, so how do you apply once you're ready? For the SAT, make sure that you have your accommodations approved before you register for a test. This is different from the ACT, and I'll explain why in a moment. But if you register for a normal test first, it's very, very hard to swap it later. Make sure you know where the nearest SAT test center is that can support accommodations. Decide the format, because from next year, you'll get a choice of paper or on computer if you need that. Make sure you've got all the documentation, including a new Ed Psych report. Ask the school to submit the request, and within about 4 to 8 weeks, you will hear back. Now, if it's granted, you will get what's called an SSD code. You then take that code and you register on mysat.collegeboard.org at least 4 weeks before the test. You use the code, and that allows you to apply for an extra time test. So don't register for the test first and hope to swap it. Very, very hard to do that. Have the SSD code first and then apply. This is why it's a good idea to start early. Once you've got that code, nice and simple, you can register for any future test dates with accommodations with that same code. No need for you or the school to reapply. ACT, a bit different. First, decide with your school what format you're going to do. Are they going to allow you to do it on paper in school, or will you have to go to a computer test center, which will probably be Marlborough College? If you're doing it at a test center, make sure you know where the nearest one is. Like I said, it's probably only Marlborough College in the UK. And make sure you have all the documentation, including a new Ed Psych report, like we said. Now, here's the big difference. For the ACT, you register for the accommodations test first, and then your school submits the accommodations. If you try and register for a normal test first, you're not going to be able to swap later. If you register for a test center, and then you try to swap it to in-school test, probably not going to happen. So make sure you know exactly what the school will allow and what is best for you, then register for that test. How do you register? Through my.ac.org, and you have to choose the right option. Now, I'm going to stop sharing and share my screen again, because I want to make sure that you are completely aware of what to do here. So I'm just going to make sure I've got this correct. Apologies while I share a different screen. I'm going to share this screen here, and hopefully you can see this. This is the ACT registration screen. I've already logged in under my pretend student account. You go to my.act.org, create an account, log in. Now, once you've filled in all the stuff about your school and everything, you then click on register for the ACT. And it warns you it's going to take you a while to register. Click on begin registration. Now, you're international, so click on outside the US. Then click that you do need accommodations. Yes, accommodations needed. Now, this is the bit that everyone gets stuck on, because if you choose the left-hand option that it looks like most people can do, you will have to do it at a test center, and it will probably be Marlborough College. So if you click on that, it's then going to take you through to this bit where you have to choose your region and your test center. Let's go back. Click on the right-hand option. Now, it looks like you can't select that, but it says you use alternate test formats. Writing, so doing it on a paper, is an alternate test format. You can do the right-hand one, as long as your school has agreed to host a test for you in the school. So if you've decided that with the school, then click that option. No writing, you do not need to do the essay. And now look, you've got different test windows. That each of these windows is 16 days starting from the official test date. So let's say we want to do December. You click on that, and then you click add to cart. December, by the way, is very, very soon, so you probably can't do that. Here's the price of it. Yes, it's expensive, but look what it says. Location arranged with your school official for special testing. Now, once you proceed to checkout and you pay, at that point, you will then get an email that you forward to your school. And I will stop sharing my screen again here. And I'm going to share the presentation again. And oh, I'm very sorry that I'm going to have to flick through a few bits to get back to that bit. So we've got down to the bit where you have registered for the ACT with accommodations. You now forward that email to your school, and then they apply. They submit all the documentation and the request. You've agreed everything with them in advance, and within 4 to 8 weeks, if granted, you will receive confirmation that you are registered for that test that you applied for, whether it's in school or at the test center. In future, it's quicker. You can register for any future test the same way, but your school still needs to confirm it at their end. So they don't need to reapply, but they do have to click on something to say, yes, they're fine with that. If you're going down the ACT on paper in school route, your school will then be sent the papers as long as you've registered in advance and had it granted at least 4 weeks in advance. And then they'll agree with you the date in that test window for you to do the paper. Things to be really careful of. Don't register too close to an ACT test date, because you might not get granted accommodations in time. If you didn't have extra time for your GCSEs or equivalent, so year 11 or grade 10, it's unlikely that you're going to get them now. But do get a new EdSite report, because that EdSite report will help them understand what accommodations you need. So it's got to be written with US standardized tests in mind. It's got to be new. Otherwise, it's unlikely to happen. Don't register for a normal time test at a test center until you're sure that's the only option. It is very, very hard to get the SAT or ACT to change their minds afterwards. Same for the ACT. Don't register for the test option for accommodations if you think the school might allow you to do it in school, because it's very hard to get them to change later. Same with the other way around. Don't register for an in-school test before agreeing with the school. So our advice is, if your school won't allow you to take the ACT in school on paper, consider doing the SAT instead. There are many more SAT test centers available for extra time, not many ACT test centers. Okay, just an update on the digital SAT. The things are changing all the time, but as I said, that's coming out in March 2023 in the UK and international, but only 24 in the US. By default, that is a digital test that is in a test center, usually a school, not your own unless you go to that school. Students use their own laptops. It's shorter, it's 2 hours long, and it is adaptive, which means it changes depending on how well you're doing. But with accommodations, you get to choose if it's on paper or computer, as long as your school submits the evidence for that and specifies it in advance. 50% extra time available in either format, paper or on computer. There is no real change in our advice, which is, as I said before, if you can get your school to do ACT on paper in school, that's great. Otherwise, consider doing the SAT. Right, I'm now moving on to what the school has to do. So again, students and families should watch this right to the end of the webinar, just so you understand what the school has to do on their side. If you are a school, please send our blog and this webinar to your students and families. And same, if you are a student or a parent, please send this webinar and the blog to your school. It will help them understand what they've got to do. So first of all, you've got to inform your students. One of the biggest problems we see on the school side is that students suddenly apply in year 12, and then they get really frantic around this time of year because they haven't got their accommodations granted. As you can see, there's a lot to do, and it can take a long time to get these things right. So we advise, sorry, I've written advice there, but we advise looking ahead. You can tell I wrote this at the last minute, but survey your students, not your students in, although there is probably some of that about as well, but survey your students in year 11, grade 10. So end of GCSEs or just before, to see who might be eligible for extra time. Inform them of their options. Make sure that they make a right decision about the test, SAT or ACT, which format. Ensure that they don't rush and book tests without speaking to you first. Advise them to get a new Ed Psych report that references standardized tests. That summer, after GCSEs, before year 12 or grade 11, is a good time to get that done. When everyone is ready, tell your ACT students to register for the test some 12 weeks before the first test date. So if they haven't registered before, make sure they book in that test. So if you're doing it in school, tell them to choose that in-school option. I've shown you how to do it in the previous section. If they're doing it at a test center, then show them how to do that. If they're doing SAT, it will be at a test center, but they don't register in advance. It's only the ACT students must register in advance for that first test date. Now, prepare the school to submit requests. First of all, does your school have a CEB code? You are going to need this anyway. When students apply to the US, they need to identify which school they go to through this code. So first of all, check on this website, you can see the thing there, to see if you have a CEB code. It's very self-explanatory. You go on there, type the name of the school in. Do check with and without apostrophes, because sometimes it doesn't always appear with apostrophes, and see if you have a code. If you don't have one, apply for one. Go to schoolcode.collegeboard.org. It's a simple login. Use your school email address, and it will allow you to make a request for a CEEB code. That's very useful. And then that is the same for both SAT and ACT. It allows a student to identify the school. It does not make you a test center. That's always been a point of confusion with schools, that they think, oh, this is making us a test center. It is not. You need it for your students to identify that they go to your school. Decide who will submit requests. It's normally the SENCO in the school. In some schools, it's the head of sixth form or university admissions officer, but decide who's going to do that. Reassure them it is not that hard, but they do need to prepare in advance. Make them register for each portal. Now, for the College Board, it goes through for the SAT, it goes through the College Board website. For the ACT, it goes through success.act.org. It's a good idea, regardless of whether you have students you think might need it, to register now. Get it ready, get the school set up, just in case you need to do things later. We've noticed recently there is sometimes some confusion on the ACT side. International schools do not need to have a trusted agent. This is something for US schools. So for international schools, the TAA coordinator, so that is the person who signed up for the ACT's portal, has the ability to make accommodations requests. International schools do not require a trusted agent to grant them this ability, but sometimes the ACT gets confused and thinks that a trusted agent is required, and they prevent the coordinator from making those requests. If that happens, contact them and just tell them, we are an international school and here's our CEB code. Make sure that they get back to you, just hound them and say, look, please, can you grant us the ability to make requests? And they should get that sorted. So once you're all sorted, how do you make the requests? It's very subtly different for the SAT and ACT. The main difference is that for the ACT, you submit the requests after they've registered for the test. So you make them register for the test date, again, making sure it's the right format, in school, on paper, or at a test centre on computer. For the SAT, it's different. They can only register for an accommodations test once they've been granted the accommodations. So just to re-clarify, ACT, get them to register first, submit the request, then they get told that they can do the test. For the SAT, submit the request for the accommodations, then they get an SSD code, which will allow them to register. So just to clarify, SAT, submit the request online via the SSD account you created in that previous slide. State whether the student needs to do the test on paper or on computer. The default is on computer for the digital SAT. Once granted, they get that SSD code. They then go online to their College Board account, and they can create that anytime, use the code, and then register for the test. They choose a test centre that allows the accommodations, and in the future, they use that same code every time they want to do the test. Nice and easy. Word of warning, they probably want to create an account with the College Board before you request accommodations, just because that way the College Board can link up the student correctly. ACT, the best thing to do is for you to get the student to register for the test, for the right test date. You then submit your request for accommodations. Once granted, they get confirmed. If you're doing it on paper in school, I'll show you what happens next. Now, in future dates, you still need to confirm the student can do the test that they've applied for. So for future dates, the student will just go and book a test, same as before. You then have to go into your TAA account and say, yes, we're happy to do this test, or yes, I'm happy for the student to go and do that at a test centre. So if you are administering the ACT in school, just to reiterate, you can administer the ACT with accommodations, which is extra time, in your own school for your own students who need it. It does not make you a test centre, and nor should you be a test centre. So please reassure your senior management they are not becoming a test centre. You're just helping your ACT students. If you don't help them do this, they will probably have to go to a test centre. And if they do the ACT, they're going to really struggle to find a place unless they go to Marlborough and book in time. So you will not administer the SAT in school, not unless you become a test centre, but don't do that. So just to reiterate, for the SAT, they will go to a test centre to do it. If ACT students registered and were granted accommodations for in-school at least 4 weeks before the test, the ACT is going to FedEx you the papers as agreed. They will provide instructions for you to how to administer it, nice and easy. You have a test window within which to do it, 16 days from the date of the official test. You decide with the student when you do it within that window. Once complete, you package up the papers and you send them back by FedEx. And the students then get their results in their online portal in 2 to 3 weeks. So what happens if your senior management says that they won't allow you to host the ACT? This is very common, so don't worry. Reassure them that you are not becoming a test centre. Explain that ACT students are unlikely to be able to take the test otherwise, unless they have to travel quite far and they'll have to do it on computer. But if there's no budging, which does happen, consider advising the student to take their SAT instead, which is a bit easier. So common issues that happen, first of all, thinking that you have to become a test centre. You do not. Not informing families early enough of the process and their options. Finding out at the last minute you don't have a CEB code and you have to apply for one. Leaving it too late to register for the SAT or ACT request portals And then things coming up, submitting documentation that's several years old, and related to that, not submitting a new EdPsych report. That means they likely will not be granted accommodations. Big problems, ACT student registers for a test centre, then wants to do it in school. Very, very hard to swap. SAT student registers for a normal time test, can't get it swapped to extra time, very difficult to change. And there's trusted agent issues. Please contact the ACT and tell them you are an international school if that happens. Okay, so for everyone, I just want to tell you what the international test dates are. So for the ACT, you've still got December that you can register for, February, April, June, July, September, October, December, loads of them. But make sure you start the process now. If you are just starting this process for the ACT for accommodations, you're probably not going to be able to do it in December, unless the school is all ready to go and you've got all the documentation. So you're probably looking at February at the earliest. But that's okay. If you're in year 12 or grade 11, that's okay. You've got time to do this. And you've still got February, April, and other dates to get this ready before the end of year 12. Current SAT, there's only one date left, and that is December. Then after that, we're looking at March. So for most students thinking about doing this, you're probably looking at March, May, and August for extra time tests. But start the process now. A little bit about us, just to finish up. We provide advice and information on all the testing applications. We've got a college counselling service. If you want to speak to us about college counselling, please go to ueseducation.com/free-call. You can book in a free call with me or my colleague to talk about college counselling. We've got week-long and weekly and school courses for the SAT and ACT. We do private tuition for those. We've got a diagnostic test. There's the link again. Partnerships for sports scholarships, consultants, and there's our contact details. So hopefully this covers everything that you need to know. But if you do end up with other questions, you're not sure how to do it, please email us. Please read the blog very carefully. And hopefully you'll be able to get this sorted. But my big advice is start early and inform everyone early, and seriously think about the right test and format before you do anything. I really hope that helps. And then, again, please contact us if you're not sure. Okay, any questions from the audience? Speak now if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A box. And these questions might end up being very helpful for anyone else. Maybe I've answered all the possible questions, in which case, fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, well, it seems that I have told everyone everything they need to know. So I am going to end the recording here. Thanks very much for listening.